This is lecture number 19 in RPH 205, Introduction to Ethics. This lecture is about Karl Marx. So Karl Marx lived after the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution, Scientific Revolution. He watched while all these utopian thinkers um, thought that science and technology would save the world or would create an entirely different um, culture and human history because we would be able to socially condition people, we would exploit nature for human well-being, people would be socially conditioned to have the skills to exploit nature and then to have all sorts of social skills and everybody everybody would flourish. It would be a great new world. And so I've mentioned over and over again how that's hasn't worked out. And each point of view got corrupted in some way. So Karl Marx at the time, during his time, pointed out the corruptions, but he was still a child of his time. He still thought we were a blank slate. He thought social conditioning is true and we can socially condition people. But his main thing was you have to change the economic system. So it's the economic system that determines how people get conditioned. And if you change the economic system, you'll change human beings. So Marx did buy into scientism, that science would save the world. He didn't question our exploitation of natural resources. And he went along with a certain kind of social conditioning, but his focus was on ending capitalist society and replacing it with a Marxist society. So we have these stereotypes about capitalism versus socialism. So today there is, I think, one country in the world that still has a controlled economy. That's North Korea. Every other country in the world has a regulated capitalism. It's not pure capitalism and it's not pure socialism. So the way we use those words is very imprecise and very distracting from what we need to do to be able to create a flourishing society. But we're talking about in Marx's time, and he critiques everything that's happened so far, and he thinks, his recommendations will lead to a fundamentally different world. All right, so let's go to his basic worldview. What was his worldview? So usually I ask students, how many of you think that your emotions, your actions, your way of life is very much affected by your parents' place in our economic system and by the fact that we live in the United States and it has a certain economic system. So, and then your parents have a certain job in that system, and that really molds you to be who you are. So I ask students to think about that. How much do they think about that? And in a lot of ways, my students would agree with Karl Marx. So that's what I want to point out, is that you can agree with his critique of capitalism, but disagree with his idea of the solution to the problems of the corruptions of capitalism. So let's start out with Marx's point of view. You are required to read Karl Marx Manifesto, and it's one of the attachments, and it's important to read it. It's a very important historical document. You should picture how influential it was at the time. So at the time, people, especially working people, had been moved from the fiefs, from being serfs on the farms, into cities to work in the industries and the factories. And there was this constant selling, telling them their lives are going to get better, and their lives didn't necessarily get better. And so finally, um, Karl Marx comes along and says, no, you have to have a complete overthrow of the takeover from the rich and distribute to the poor before we're going to have prosperity. But Marx did think we will have prosperity if we do that, because Marx thought we had reached the end of economic development, industrial. So, so for Marx, we would continue exploiting nature, and we could continue creating a more equitable economic system, and then everybody would flourish. But first, you have to take over the means of production from the capitalists and have it governed by the proletariat, and then things will work out. And so his particular brand of utopianism did not work either. And that's why I think you have to switch to a systems paradigm. You have to switch to a totally different paradigm. But I'll get to that in a while. So Marx thinks his, if you remember, John Locke is our founders, 1776, those revolutions based on rights, and then there was utilitarianism, and now there's Marx. Well, he's going to base his view on science, facts, conclusions based on facts. He says, I'm talking about real people and the conditions under which they live. And people become who they become by doing what they do to survive. And the nature of individuals is molded by the material conditions determining their nation's production, right? The economic system and their consciousness, their thoughts, emotions, actions, and identity is determined by what they have to do to survive. Life determines consciousness. Consciousness is determined by life or survival. So, okay, so the blank slate, we are born blank. It's not genetics that determines who we become, but the environment. That he's in agreement with the utilitarians there. But not any aspect of the environment, only one aspect of it, the economic structure of the person's society and their place in that structure. That's what determines who they become. So he disagreed with Locke. We're not born free and equal. We're born social and dependent. He disagrees with Mill. We are molded by society, but Mill's view of the higher pleasures and the kind of rulers who would create a society based on them is the bourgeoisie of capitalist society. He disagrees with Hobbes, who thought that human beings are by nature selfish and wicked. Hobbes advocated for a very strong, centralized leader, disagrees with that. He disagrees with de Condorcet, who is a French intellectual who thought human beings were perfectible, and we were aiming toward perfection. The progress of the human mind to perfection was going to happen. And Karl Marx said, well, it can't happen until the economic system is no longer adversarial and oppressive. So, but we will be able to attain it when the entire society is based on equality in every sense, but it starts with economic equality. He disagreed with Rousseau. Rousseau thought that it was before that civilization corrupts people. And he's thinking of a noble savage back in the old days, before money before accumulation of wealth, before vanity and greed. Um, the noble savage was sort of like the Garden of Eden. And Marx didn't agree with that. He thought capitalism was necessary to develop human nature and culture to a certain point, but now it has to be overthrown. So the Industrial Revolution, Scientific Revolution enabled a huge number of people, as a matter of fact, everybody, to develop their higher order capacities and to become fully human. It's just that we have to redistribute wealth. All right. So the relations between nations depends on each nation's economic development, what kind of economy they have, and how well developed it is. So, I mean, we always talk about developed and developing nations. We talk about um, American capitalism and how developed it is. And there's, we're questioning whether it does provide happiness. But definitely we have this gap between developing and developed nations, and that's based on economics. The relations within a nation depends upon the nation's economic development and the extent of that development. So during the feudal era, it was the serfs, the knights, a few bourgeoisie in the towns, and then the person who owns the fief, right? Owns the estate. And then in capitalist society, it's the owner of the people who runs the industries, people who run the industries, and then the people who work for them. And then he says in a communist society, the relations um, between uh, people who run the economic system and the people who work, there won't be any split. They'll take turns playing these different roles as a person who runs something and the person who um, does what they're told, and then they'll take turns. And so nobody gets their identity caught up in their social role in the economic system. But so far in history, there's the nature of the economy determines how the labor is divided. And the division of labor implies that each person has one identity at home as a human being and another identity at work as whatever they are labeled as according to the economic system, what they do to survive. Whenever a human being's social identity is separated from their personal identity, their work is alienated labor, okay? So I disagreed with Adam Smith. Do you remember Adam Smith claimed that the division of labor was a great good because it enabled everyone to have so many more consumer goods. So if you remember, I was talking about the blacksmith that makes horseshoes and the pins that go in the horse to hold up the horseshoe. And if the blacksmith was working at their forge, they can make maybe 25 a day. But if you have a factory and everybody just does one little job and it goes through the assembly line, you can have 1,000 or more horseshoes and pins. So that was Adam Smith thought capitalist and division of labor was going to create this incredible prosperity. So Karl Marx thought it was bad because it dehumanized people. People just become an extension of a machine. It makes their human value into their exchange value, their monetary value. It turns people into products or commodities. So, I mean, nowadays in a high-tech world, sometimes I feel like everybody's being made into an extension of the machine, and sometimes I get into conversations where people talking about their internet or Canvas, and I think, why do we bother studying anything except how computers work? Because we get so preoccupied with it. But then I go back and do my philosophy, and then I'm happy. Um, Alienated labor. In an economic system where people are oppressed, those who are on the bottom of the economic ladder are alienated from, right? What are they alienated from? The product of their labor. They don't care about it. Okay. They're pouring their energy or their humanity into making it, while the factory owner is getting all of the profit. They're getting most of the profit, right? So they're forced to pour their humanity into a material thing that somebody else gets to make a lot of money from. They don't make a lot of money, they're surviving. Workers are alienated from themselves because they spend their lives doing something they don't identify with. They have a social identity as the bricklayer, the teacher, which is controlled by the rich. They have to hide who they really are while doing what they're forced to do. So they become pawns in a great economic game that mostly the rich benefit from. They're alienated from other workers because the owners force them to compete with each other in order to survive. Workers are pitted against each other and made to work as hard as possible in order for the owner to profit as much as possible. Workers are alienated from nature because capitalism in particular requires exploiting natural resources in order to increase wealth. Capitalism is always exploitative because the workers never get paid for the value of what they produce. The owner gives the workers only part of the profits and keeps the rest for his personal use and for reinvestment in the factory, upkeep, new ventures, etc. Labor is always alienated in a capitalist system. Locke's view that a democratic capitalist system is one where free and equal adults, okay, so this as opposed to Locke, right? Locke, claims that in a democratic capitalist system, everybody's free and equal to engage in writing and signing contracts between free, equal, consenting adults in marriage, politics, education, economics, right? And Marx thinks that's completely false. He thinks it's a perfect set of ideas. It's based on exploitation of labor. The laborers have no other choice because the system is rigged in terms of signing a decent contract. The employers meet together to make sure they collectively don't pay the workers very much and nobody tries to outbid somebody else. So the labor is alienated. It's not free and equal. It's actually a perfect set of ideas to justify the private capitalism. All right, so historical materialism, all right? In the past, all economic systems have been based on the exploitation of the working class. All the systems have depended on alienated labor and on the fixation of social activity, which means you are what you do in the economic sector. And nobody really is that. That isn't their humanity. That's just how they are getting used. The Greeks had the slaves versus the free men. So when Aristotle talks about virtue, right? He's talking when he talks about eating, not too much, not too little, eating for the right reason in the right way, eating as part of a social network, all this wonderful stuff. It sounds great. But a poor person would say, I don't have healthy food. I don't have enough of it. And you shouldn't criticize me because I can't eat the right thing. I can't afford it. I can't eat in the right way because I'm working 3 jobs and I'm never home to be with my family and have a nice meal at the right time, all this. So, if you're a working class person in a capitalist society, you can't exercise those virtues because you just don't have the time, the money, or the health. Um, okay, so Aristotle's virtues have been criticized as basically the virtues of an elite. I think you can adapt them. I think you can say that if you look internationally at what foods are the native foods of a certain area, they usually are foods that are healthy and the easiest to grow and the least expensive. But given the geography of each country, it's figured out how to how to have a food system that's healthy. But the problem now is that we have an international food system that's very unhealthy. But again, you could say that even today, eating the right thing is impossible for the working class because um, sugar, the food that's the cheapest working class people can afford, is giving people diabetes and heart disease and all sorts of stuff. So you have to look at Aristotle's model with a grain of salt, but I don't think you should reject it. I think people can have middle class uh, income and still achieve many of those virtues. And the other problem is, what do you do? I mean, it's a goal to aim for. So perhaps you have to work weeknights and you can't eat with your children, but you can on the weekends. So you're always aiming to maximize virtue. What about the Romans? They had the slaves, the plebeians, and the aristocrats. And so they also had this model of virtue. The sage is in tune with nature. The sage is a microcosm in the macrocosm. But, that was a life of leisure compared to what most of the Romans, how most of them lived. In feudalism, you had the knights, the serfs, the fief owners, and the workers, and that was related to their source of wealth, and it was always exploitative. The serfs were exploited for their labor. They didn't get the value of it. The fief owners um, took most of the profit, benefited the most. And in industrial capitalism, there's only two classes, right? Marx says the latest wave of economics has reduced the class war to just two classes, right? The owners and the workers. Um, in the past, because these economic arrangements were exploitative, they ended up destroying themselves. Those who were exploited couldn't remain that way forever. During the feudal era, the fief owners depended upon shop owners in the towns. They were called burghers, bourgeoisie, to supply goods they needed. As technology improved, they needed or wanted more and more of those kinds of goods, like plows, better weapons, um, technology, right? And that was um, products that were developed or created because of a combination of science and higher levels of technology, better forges, better metals, and creating products made out of metal or creating, there was a huge explosion in science and technology. And so those are the products you sell in the town, and the fief owners wanted more and more of those products. So gradually, the burghers had more control of the economy and then eventually power. So eventually, it was inevitable that the capitalists would overthrow the fief owners. They set up a monetary system and gained political party in the ruling bodies of the time and place. The British Revolution of 1688, the American Revolution, and the French Revolution were not really, according to Marx, about liberty, equality, and fraternity. They were about the bourgeoisie taking over power and privilege from the landed aristocrats, those who inherited their land through landed estates. So there was a rise in a change in economics. There was also this huge gap between the rich and the poor that aggravated it. But the capitalists have also set up a world which is self-destructive. In order to survive, capitalists have an exploited working class. When that class realizes it's being exploited, it will inevitably revolt, and the rule of the proletariat is inevitable. So, I mean, as I've pointed out, like our capitalist system is becoming more and more out of balance, and then it's becoming more and more unstable. So then politically motivated, power motivated people claim that they can fix it, and then they get elected or put into power, and they end up centralizing wealth the same or more, but with their family and their friends and their business buddies or whatever. Okay. So the world of capitalism, this is the way capitalism works. It creates a world in its own image. Every activity is made into a commodity and sold for a price. Nothing is sacred. Soldiers, ministers are just workers who get paid a salary and have a career trajectory. No one is really motivated by honor, patriotism, or love of God. They just get paid to claim to represent these things, but it's just another job underneath it all. So I've heard students, there's a lot of Americans that go into the military because it's a good job opportunity, good career opportunity, or they'll go into the National Reserve for that reason. It's extra money. Um, yeah, so much for war, so much for worrying about unjust wars. It's all reduced to a matter of salaries, and you don't question what wars you're getting sent into because it's your job to do whatever the generals or the government tells you to do. All right, ministers are not speaking for God. They just have a salary and they have these careers, and then they have to, they have a role. It's just a social role, and nothing more than that. Capitalists need to constantly change and grow their companies in order to compete. So they have to make their workers change, move, compete with each other, etc. So when we have someone becomes unemployed, sometimes they need to be re-educated to get a different job. In order to keep growing, capitalists must always find new markets. They commodify everything within their own nations, and then they try to enter other nations in order to find new markets to sell their products and new natural and human resources to exploit from which to make their products. So this is about global colonialism, right? The West went all over the world, the developing world. They exploited the resources. They still do, but it started out during the Enlightenment. And sometimes they enslave the people they find. Sometimes they just make them into basically indentured servants. They have to work super hard for super low salaries. Anyway, so the West, in the name of capitalism, in the name of free, equal, and rights, they just go all over the world. So again, the Europeans, the Americans said, well, I have a right to exploit these people's resources because it's God's will for us. God gave us the earth, and God wants us to work hard and be industrious. And these people don't know, and they would prefer to say they don't have the capacity to have the kind of knowledge we have. So we're superior, so we're justified in making them do menial labor and in taking their resources. So, for example, England would make India grow cotton and then send the cotton over to Britain to the factories to make into cotton cloth and make into clothing and then export that back to India. They did the same with tea, make it into tea bags. So that's how Britain became an empire. They they took natural resources, they ran it through their factories and sold um, manufactured goods. Um, Capitalism changes the entire world, from rural to urban, from agricultural to industrial, from religious to secular, from living by habit to novelty, from customs and traditions to facts and profits. All right, so this is still going on, right? Um, the one of the big disruption that's going to happen in our time is a move from rural to urban. The trajectory, the prediction is that we will go from 50% of people in the world living in cities to 80%. Okay, and that's similar to when the serfs moved into the cities and worked in factories. Now, the agricultural, the number of jobs from agriculture continues to decline, and then small towns cannot keep up with developments in technology. People have to move to the city to get the education they need to run the sophisticated machines. And then most of those machines and those companies are located in cities. So people are moving into cities. Capitalism makes a family into an economic relationship rather than a religious or an emotional one. So, yeah, John Locke, said the church had said that marriage is sacred and they made divorce illegal. John Locke says no, it's a relationship between two free, equal consenting adults, and you can get divorced when your kids grow up and they're economically independent. And Karl Marx just says this is just a this is just an economic relationship. So people still marry each other because of what class they belong to. The whole marriage itself is just the reason why it's an official state. Uh, People need to be married is because the children they have need to inherit their parents' wealth. And so wealth becomes the driver behind this whole system. Now, John Locke would not be happy with that, and Adam Smith would not be happy with the degree to which this is um, dominating everything else. But it is what it is, and Karl Marx knew this is described this as was what's happening, and it just continues to happen. Um, all right, so let's see. I hope you understand that the move from religious to secular was our John Locke, um, uh, even Kant and Descartes, they were deists, and religion wasn't as important to them. They believed in God, but they weren't going to make a whole culture with an official state religion or anything. So you have Descartes, Kant, Locke, and then John Stuart Mill wanted empathy is a natural impulse. That would be our foundation. So they all went from emphasizing religion to separating it and a secular foundation for culture. They went from agricultural to industrial, from rural to urban, from living by habit to moving into a city, becoming an individual, right? Who wants to develop themselves and they move around and they change jobs or whatever, but there's a lot more mobility and there's a lot more change. and there's a lot more adapting to changes that the changes occur because of the capitalist economic system. Um, and you don't live so much by custom and tradition. You pull yourself away from that, especially in America. And then you pull for the sake of upward economic and social mobility. You can come, it's the land of opportunity, so you can prosper, so you can move up the social ladder, which means you'll be able to make money because the economic system is different. Um, it's not based on inherited wealth, inherited estates. Capitalism makes the family into an economic relationship. Families are uprooted. Their extended family, their heritage is all destroyed by the need to move and discredited as unimportant and dated, old-fashioned values. Capitalism and all exploitative economic systems make male-female relationships into economic relationships. People marry based on class, on preserving family fortune or the family name, and rich people consider infidelity a way of exerting power and privilege. Because capitalism has changed the entire world and created one huge exploited class, the revolution of this class, the takeover of the means of production by the proletariat, will lead to the end of history and the end of economic exploitation. So, says, up until now, all the way through human history, there's been economic exploitation. There have been the owners and the workers, the haves and the have-nots. And history has gotten us to this point where we have just two classes, and the capitalist class is smaller and more obviously greedy, and the proletariat class is more and more obviously being oppressed, and they can be made to recognize that it's global, and you have this global revolution where the workers take over, and they create an economic system which is not exploitative. Because they had been exploited, they're not going to turn around and do the same thing. Once the proletariat takes over, there will be no gap between the owners and the workers. In an industrial society, people in an industrialized society, so Marx thought it was good that everything got industrialized. But because then people will live in cities, they'll only have to work in a factory for about 30 hours a week to make the consumer goods that we need that are necessary. So the only reason they have to work so hard now is because the owner's making excess profits and the rich are buying all sorts of unnecessary things. But in a communist society, you won't have that. People won't exploit each other. They won't identify with what they do in the factory. They won't compete. They'll value each other's humanities. They will work wherever they're placed, right? The government decides where you're going to work, and what's going to be produced, for the good of everyone. Their work will be dedicated to the common good. Everything is dedicated to the common good. They will make things people really need, and that everyone has the same things. Everyone will be middle class, about the same size and type of house, car, whatever, so that people will value each other as people, not according to what they have. People will have time to be creative, to relax, to take care of their children, to have friends, to have a social life, to be human. Only in a communist society can people be truly free and equal. So it's not, Marx agrees that freedom and equality and the development of your capabilities is really important. But he says you're going to have a revolution, a takeover by the proletariat before we can ever get there. Okay, in the past, the ruling ideas of every age are the ideas of the ruling class. So all of the ideas you've read so far in this class were written by men of power and privilege and their ideas were motivated by the desire to justify their power and privilege. So Aristotle, the theory of the golden mean. Well, that's a great image. Not eating too much or too little, not drinking too much or too little, have long-term sexual relationships, being afraid of the right thing for the right reason, having good friends, knowing yourself, um, ruling for the sake of the ruled, being intellectually curious. All right, the trouble is, if you're poor, you don't have the food, so you can't exercise the mean in relation to food because you don't have enough of it, or it's not healthy because it's cheap. The cheap food isn't healthy. Drinking, you might drink too much to drink away to make yourself numb to the rotten situation you're in. Marriage is, it's difficult to get married or stay married if you're too poor to actually support a family. Courage, poor people have way, way different things to be afraid of than rich people do. So the privileged class, they're not that afraid, but they're protected, right? They're not afraid of whether they have food tomorrow, and they're not afraid of whether someone's going to try to steal, um, try to hurt them. They're not afraid of trying to find a decent place to live. They just don't face any of the same fears. Working class people are the ones that go to war. Anyway, so their friendships are totally different. Um, it's hard to know yourself. It's hard to know what your real talents are and how you would use them for the benefit of other people if you never have a chance to develop them. Justice is rule for the benefit of the ruled. Poor people have very little opportunity to exercise justice because they don't have power. They have very little, they don't have time for intellectual curiosity. So this is definitely a model of virtue that's exclusively for a privileged class. Again, I think you can apply it in a way that makes it accessible. But I know people who apply it in a way that that is reactionary. The good old days when Western white men ruled. That is a very bad application, but it's there. Seneca has also become popular among intellectuals, but they say, everybody's equal, but only the Stoic knows the truth, and they should be the tutors of the emperors. So they hold the power of being the educator of the emperors. Um, so, um, people who read it today are people of privilege. They don't realize they're reading their privilege into it. For example, Marcus Aurelius has meditations. He was considered a philosophical leader, and he's meditating on how, people are always coming to him and asking him for favors and kissing up to him more. He's always having to deal with all these problems. Well, but he's an emperor, you know? And so someone who maybe runs a corporation, and this is true, CEOs they like reading Seneca. They identify with them. But Seneca doesn't worry about whether his wife is getting a decent career for her and whether she's able to use her gifts and for get a job related to her talents, get the education related to her talents. And a thoughtful man today is going to worry about that. If he has a spouse, he wants her to also develop. And then he doesn't worry at all about his children. And his son was really a jerk, grew up to be a horrible person. Well, he was never home. He was also always out fighting, or hanging out. Well, he was separated from family because of his duties as an emperor. So people who are reading it don't realize there's a lot of privilege built into the way you read it. Augustine was critical of the Greeks and the Romans because of the way the classical teachers, the teachers at his school, were so corrupt. And he converted to Christianity. And so he wanted Christianity to control the educational system, the political system. He wanted the religious leaders to control the economic system. He wanted the Pope to have more power than the kings. Aquinas, the Catholic Church knows the truth and should therefore influence kings, educate princes, and basically dominate the culture. Then Francis Bacon throws all that out, and he claims, we're going to do truth now, science. But Karl Marx would say that scientists are the ones that know the truth, or the people who apply scientific knowledge. So they should control the educational system, the people, which in turn will be the ideas that drive people who go out and run the economic system and the political system. So the scientists are the ones, science is the ultimate value. The scientists are the ones that should run things. Hobbes, okay, I'm not going to talk about Hobbes. I guess it's Locke. Okay, free, equal consenting adults who are able to calculate the most efficient means to their own economic interest. They are really just capitalist owners of the means of production in disguise, right? They didn't work up the land from nothing. They had more privilege in the first place, and they used it to gain more and more wealth. Plus, if you just tell the workers that they're free and equal and they can calculate the most efficient means to their own economic self-interest, well, the most rational thing for them to do is sign the contracts that they get, even though the contracts are very exploitative, but it's better than starving in the street. So the capitalist system sets it up where the workers, under the ideology of freedom, equal rights, the right to sign a contract or not. You're not a slave. You're not forced to do anything, but indirectly, they definitely are forced and they're exploited. De Condorcet, it just so happens the enlightened few in France know the direction civilization is going, right? He knows that we're perfectible, and so the enlightened leaders should control the way the culture develops. All right, so we have a number of other intellectuals. Mill, those who are trained to love the higher pleasures, like me, are those who should rule the nation and train everyone else to be like them. Donald Trump, I provide the greatest happiness by providing jobs. I deserve political power. Everybody else should be like me to be a great American. I wrote this like 25 years ago. Al Gore, this is the 2000 election, so truly, I mean 25 years ago. I care about the middle and lower classes. That's what democracy is all about. Vote for me. And Karl Marx says, I really care about the working classes, the oppressed. I know what is needed, revolution, and I know what will result from a revolution is the gradual withering away of any need for power over other people. People will willingly work together. So you should give the communists power. You should join the communist revolution. Okay, so what happened? How come this didn't work out? So the Communist Manifesto talks about the temporary dictatorship of the proletariat. So temporarily, the workers will have a revolution and take over the means of production, but gradually it'll get dispersed and everybody will be equal. Stalin, however, was not a Marxist. And so if you are a Marxist, a real believer in communism, you wouldn't say that communism has failed. You would say it's never been tried. But then you ask, well, why was it never tried? Well, what happens, and Aristotle says this in his Politics, that if you are a leader and you want to be able to lead, and you want your children and your grandchildren actually, the best way to make it the highest probability that your family would have power in the future is if you actually rule for the benefit of the ruled. You're actually just, because then people would flourish under your leadership and they would trust you so you could maintain your leadership. But if you just amass more and more money and power for yourself and your friends and your family, the underclass will get angry and unstable, and then you will lose your power. And so that's what Aristotle said the reason for these revolutions wasn't just the Industrial Revolution. I mean, that's part of it, the change in the kind of economy, but it was also that the owners, the people who were the richest under the old economy, didn't adapt and they didn't distribute the wealth from the new economic system. And if they had been more just, then you wouldn't need a you wouldn't have a revolution. The trouble with revolutions is they usually don't solve anything. And usually there's so much anarchy for so long that somebody comes up and is a strong man, is an all-powerful leader, and the poor just get abused again. The the strong man takes the power and gives it to his friends and family, who are different than the previous ruling class, but still the workers don't benefit. So we're heading that way, right? Our capitalism has gotten way too centralized, and Donald Trump's people vote for him because they think he is pulling money away from the rich and distributing it better, or they trust that he's better at it than the Democrats. That's about it. I think a lot of people are pretty skeptical, but they'll still vote for him. They trust him more than they trust the Democrats. Okay, Marx's goal was a revolution of the proletariat, the establishment of a communist society in the place of the old bourgeoisie society with its classes and class antagonisms. We shall have an association in which the free development of each person is the condition for the free development of all. So, you have everybody flourishing. The means to that goal, how do you get to that goal? Well, industrializing all societies so every human being can work 30 hours in a factory and have a middle-class life, the creation of an international proletariat class, the awareness of people in that class that they're being exploited, the revolution of the proletariat, the takeover of the means of production from the bourgeoisie, the temporary dictatorship of the proletariat, abolish private property, abolish right to inheritance, heavy income tax, national banks, communication and transportation controlled by the state, takeover of instruments of production by the state. Every able-bodied person must work. Combine agriculture with manufacturing so the population is redistributed, and free education for all in public schools, free daycare, no officially documented marriage. People live with who they want, and you abolish nationality. So you create a global awareness of oppression and a global non-oppressive and non-oppressed culture. All right, so what happened? In Russia, we had Trotsky and Lenin were leading this movement, but then Stalin took over, and they didn't like Stalin. They knew Stalin was not interested in distributing wealth. He was interested in power. There was a lot of instability. There was a power vacuum. Stalin was the strong man who stepped in. What about Mao, right? Same thing in China. It was the change from agricultural economy to an industrial economy. There was this change going on, and it's causing a lot of disruption. And the countries where there's a huge gap between the rich and the poor, that's even more disruption. So, what about Mao? Well, I was in China in 2010, and the what people say about Mao is that originally he really was willing to die for the people. He really was working for the benefit of the oppressed. And then when he got into power, he got corrupt and he started to oppress. So the Chinese talked about the early Mao and the late Mao. So then um, Xi Jinping, um, I think that was his name, he opened China up to private sector, to capitalism, but it's heavily regulated by the state. So you still have the state in charge of industries. Now the communist society allows for private companies to come in and make products, but they tax them quite a bit. Also, the government gives research and development money to companies, and the companies try to create products that then they can sell, and then they pay back the loans. So China has a much more dynamic relationship between the private and the public sector. And they also have a much larger public sector. They have large taxes and they have a lot of services. So Chinese people will have vouchers for food, shelter. They have housing provided, transportation provided, healthcare provided, education provided. And people can go over and above that and get private education or additional health care, I think. But everybody gets a pretty good life, and the taxes are high. Um, all right. So, what about so in China, that what they call it socialism with a no, um, Chinese, so no, socialism with a Chinese character. Okay. And then we call our system capitalism with an American character. Because, socialism in China is good, except that the Chinese, have this certain little version of it, which includes capitalism. And over here in America, capitalism is good, but of course we have our little version of it with some socialism, like Social Security and, you know, public education. So it's funny how the rhetoric is appealing to whatever is habitual, whatever people habitually want to hear, rather than, well, let's just look at the facts. Um, Cambodia had Pol Pot. So there were a number of revolutions and the poor were struggling. So power-hungry people took over in the name of communism, but they tended to be, well, Pol Pot was a dictator. He was horrible. But Ho Chi Minh really wanted the well-being of the Vietnamese. And the US went and tried to wipe him out, but the Vietnamese people knew he was on their side. He cared about them. So the he was resisted quite a bit. And we had a lot of problems with that because it was colonialism. In the name of trying to prevent the spread of communism, many of our leaders what they really wanted was imperialism, American political domination of the world. Would Marx say his theories failed or they were never tried? I think they were never tried, but were they never tried because they're too utopian? So if, Marx thought you can centralize power, you can give a very few people all the economic power and all the political power, and they will distribute it. They won't be corrupt. They won't keep it for themselves. And I think Aristotle would say that's too naive. It didn't work. But everything else was naive too. John Stuart Mill was naive. We can program people to be virtuous. John Locke was naive, thinking that this was going to work forever just on a barter system. Adam Smith knew we were going to have to raise people to be generous, but he did, you know, he didn't bother to talk about, well, what happens when the resources the whole world run out? He didn't worry about it. It was too far in the future. So now we have this problem. Saddam Hussein, he follows the trajectory of a lot of developing countries that he stood up to the West because the West was exploiting his country for oil. And he got elected, or he got put into power, because he rejected the traditionalists that just let the West come and do whatever they wanted, just made deals with them. And there were also communist revolutions, but he was a nationalist who wanted to nationalize the oil companies. And so all these same dynamics are playing out in all the developing countries. Um, all right. So what's a Marxist analysis of the social changes that have occurred in the post-industrial age, right? Computers and technology have become the dominant means of production. Instead of industry being the final wave of economic development, another wave has occurred. So Marx couldn't anticipate this. So people say, Marx understood this, but he thought history would come to an end with the proletariat revolution, and that's not true, right? We have another wave of economic development. The new economy has created a new means of production, a new relationship between nations based on their means of production, technological. The new economy has created a new set of relationships among people in technological societies. The new age culture is less sexist, less racist, more secular, more global, um, more open to sexual orientations, and interested in environmental protection, right? So why? Because you're good at technology. Who's good at technology? So the new ideology will be oriented toward making money in a high-tech society. Well, um, a CEO uh, of Apple or Microsoft, if a woman is just as good as a guy or better than a guy, sure, I'll hire her. If a gay person is, I'm into making money. And racism, sexism, discriminating against people based on race or sex or sexual orientation, I'll just lose money if I do that. So it's all about money. But, it's self-righteous about, well, I'm not sexist, I'm not racist, I just hire the best person for the job. So you can think of yourself as moral, but actually you're just trying to make money. On the other hand, other people will think you're immoral because you're not following the Bible. And of course, that's way back in the past. And in America, especially, that that should not be the case. It's illegal to discriminate on the basis of religious values, or it was until recently. The new economy has created a new kind of marginalized class. So farmers, factory workers, service occupations. There's a lot of jobs that don't exist anymore, right? Industry, and it's being replaced by robots. And even service occupations are. So what are we going to do? So during COVID, I think we realized that children do need to be in a classroom, and that businesses do require some face-to-face people coming into the office. But most people now work a combination of partly at home, working from home, and partly in the office. So, and environmental protection is becoming a deal. Green technology is, becoming more and more. It's the next wave. And so my view is you've got to change your whole way of thinking to get there. because of the reality. But so the new economy has created a new set of relationships. The new economy has created a new kind of marginalized class. The new values and class structure is based on whether a person chooses to adapt to the realities of high tech. Politicians have to adapt to the new age, online campaigning, email messages, um, high-tech healthcare, computer education. So, yeah, politicians, I mean, they're considering making laws on limiting social media, for example. That's a totally technological-based economy kind of issue. Um, there's just lots of stuff now where because we are technology driven, the laws have to keep up pace. So the end of history did not happen. Instead, we have a new kind of class system. So, conclusion, Marx had a lot of important insights, and he was unable to see to the high-tech era, but we can still use Marx to analyze much of our society. We can still understand why Marxist revolutions took place all around the world and why socialist or communist parties still exist, and they play a part in many multi-party societies. Okay, so there still is a lot of appeal, political appeal to workers, and to say, if you vote for me, I will tax the rich and give the money to you to have your agricultural based job or life, right? In rural towns, people are not keeping up with technology necessarily. And so they vote for somebody who wants the good old days. Make America great again means the life they had, but that's not where history's headed, and it's not going to last. Um, when the United Nations works with other countries, the presence of Marxist or socialist or communist parties doesn't mean they intend to stir up a revolution. They intend to make or keep certain businesses, public services, government owned, which are not government owned in the US. So the UN, there's an argument for having the United Nations step up and be more influential in the making of laws like the laws of the sea, international criminal court, because we're so interconnected. And so in a high-tech world, everybody's very interconnected. So we should have laws that are global, not just national and not just statewide or local, right? We really need a whole legal system. We need a whole set of social networks binding all people together with the common goal of environmental protection and diversity, equity, and inclusion, because that'll get us where we want to go in terms of um, developing a middle class. So some of the main issues here are, how do you create a middle class in a new economic structure? Okay, so, and I would say right now, we're not doing a very good job of it. And we're not doing a good job of protecting the environment. But the economies will change, and I think they'll probably change pretty quickly in the next 10, 20 years. But definitely for a college student, in their lifetime, economies will change quite a bit. So this is the Communist Manifesto. I don't think I made you read the whole thing. I think I cut cut it just so you read the sections, but it's important. The specter is haunting Europe, specter of communism. So there are these communist movements at the time. What does he say? The history of all hitherto existing societies is the history of class struggle, right? And so, this is just like Mill and Kant. These people really thought that the Enlightenment will recreate human nature and human culture and human history will be substantially different. So it's not fair, to just accuse Marx of being utopian, like they were all utopian, the French, everybody. So that's the Communist Manifesto, and it's been a very influential document. And I think especially if you live in a developing country, you should know the influence of that document. Like when he says capitalists go all over the world and exploit resources, that's the story of your nation in the last 50, 100 years. That's exactly what they did. So, of course, people in developing countries are interested in Karl Marx. Now, what would Marx say about the USA? Okay, okay, what would he say? All right. What would Karl Marx say about us? Nope. Yeah, okay. All right. Um, the main ideas in Marx: economic determinism, alienated labor, capitalism creates a world in its own image, no professions are sacred, all this stuff, family molds people to be rational in the sense of always calculating the most efficient means to their own self-interest. It makes people selfish. They have no interest in or ability to think about the common good. Natural rights doctrine was created by white male capitalists to support their interests, and to give them power and privilege. So like Locke's doctrine, which was taken over, absorbed by our founding fathers, was a way to justify a rebellion, a revolution against Britain, and to form their own, not political system, an economic system. Utilitarianism was created by those who lost out in the first wave of industrial capitalism and found a way to justify their own power and privilege. Everyone is supposed to think about themselves and just add up the total to get what is best for all. It's not the same as understanding the common good. It's what makes, just maximizing pleasures, and each person counts as one, is different than forgetting about your own pleasure, forgetting about your own happiness, and thinking only about the happiness of everyone. The new age, the high tech, you could say Marx was wrong. Industrial capitalism was not the end of history. We have a new wave. Using Marx's analysis of economic determinism, the tech era has created a new economic base, new relationships between people and between nations based on technology. It's true. Women's rights, gay and lesbian, environment protection, use of science, combined with more and more information in politics, law, education, public policy, can all be connected back to the change in the economic base of our society. The United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, the New World Order, are political values motivated by the desire for capitalist entrepreneurs in computers and tech to keep creating new markets for themselves, right? In the past, um, capitalists made more money from war. Now they make more money from peace. So peace will become a value. I guess I wrote that a while ago. But the wars we have are left over from the past. They're not due to the change to technology. The war in Europe is related to the Cold War, and the war in Israel is related to the World War II, and when the Jews wanted to come to Israel after the Holocaust. So those wars are just left over. They're not caused by the disruptions related to technology. Now, the animosity between the US and China is because China is becoming a very high-tech country, and they're outperforming us in electric vehicles and a whole lot of other products. So we're being undercut economically. We're, being threatened with not being the number one economic power. And so and China can do that because they're very good they live in cities already. They work together, they're very cooperative. They accept the government having a plan and following through on that plan. And there's a lot of things that China's history and culture lends itself to being very successful in a high-tech economy. That children don't mind studying all day. Um, they get conditioned to accept it. So they get really high levels of STEM education, whether or not they're taught to be creative, but they do get the discipline. Whereas America, the leaders are telling people they don't have to believe in evolution. So we're just rejecting, many of our people are rejecting science. They're not moving forward in a high-tech economy. They might be using social media, but they're not creating a new green tech product to sell. We're not investing in green technology the way China is. So we're behind. And China is on the rise because of this disruption and this new industrial revolution to technology. Um, in the new age, global politics, when the workers took over, they abused their power, or the dictators took over in the name of the temporary dictatorship. So, but Marxism, socialism still has an appeal in nations that are being exploited by Western capitalists. It should be obvious because it's a critique of the whole capitalist system. Native people want to nationalize industries so their national resources are not exploited. Indigenous knowledge has become a big deal because we are destroying the earth, and indigenous people do have land, land rights to a lot of acreage, and they don't want, they want to treat it the way they were traditionally treating it. So that can also be grafted on to high tech, green tech. So we'll have to figure out, how the economy is going to work. It's not just green engineering that's going to drive everything. It will change the methods of production. For example, our healthcare system, we will have a lot of healthcare workers, which we do. The thing about that system, it's so broken. So what kind of healthcare workers will we have? We'll still have teachers, but the teachers will teach different subjects. They'll start teaching more STEM. Sometimes rulers make shady deals with the West, cheap oil in exchange for military. But many nations at this point want to join the international market and they want to become more democratic. And again, I typed this up 20, 25 years ago. And it's interesting because what happened was the globalization process was mismanaged. So a very few American capitalists got control of it. And people were expecting that globalization would lead them into the middle class. And a lot of people have been disappointed because it's been based on capitalism, it's been exploitive. And so there are more revolutions. I mean, there's more disruption. And then these politically ambitious people like Stalin are telling the people, if you vote for me, I will redistribute. I'll take away from those capitalists and I'll make a more socialist economy or I'll redistribute wealth. And so they're gaining power, but then they don't do what they said. They're just plain old-fashioned strongmen. So we're in a very disruptive time right now, but and social media, of course, disrupts it even more. But in the end, I think whoever gets the green tech economy, whoever gets to sell the most stuff and move forward in that direction is going to have an advantage. What kind of economy? Internally, okay, so China has an authoritarian society. Are they going to loosen up? Um, and how are they going to adapt as things change? Um, all right, and so that's the story there. I think personally it's an exciting time to live because I, I, students, I tell them, you will have to deal with the next phase of industrialization. And it was just until recently, I would get in trouble for saying things like that because it just wasn't, people were not admitting it. Um, and there's one more short quote from George Bush, the Bush administration, which I think is interesting. Um, so October 2004, um, so the summer of 2002, okay. He wrote an article, he quoted Karen Hughes, Bush's communication director. He had a meeting with a senior advisor to Bush. Um, he expressed, okay, he said, David Susskind says, I wrote an article um, that he didn't like about Bush's former communication director, Karen Hughes. And so he called me in to have a meeting with his senior advisor. He expressed the White House's displeasure. He told me something that at first I didn't comprehend, but now he says gets to the heart of the Bush presidency. This is important. He said that guys like me were in what we call the reality-based community, people who believe that solutions emerge from your judicious study of discernible reality, right? And Susskind nodded and said something about enlightened principles and empiricism, um, which again I think could also be what the Athenians were trying to teach the Greek citizens to do, to reason based on the facts of a case and in the assembly to draw conclusions based on facts, not rhetoric. But he cut me off. That's not the way the real world works anymore, he said. We're an empire now. When we act, we create our own reality. And while you're studying that reality, judiciously, as you say, we'll act again, creating other new realities, which you can study too, and that's how things will sort out. We're history's actors, and you will be left just to study what we do. And so this was way back in 2002. They said, we're just going to create our own reality. Well, of course, that's gotten worse and worse and worse. And the Trump train talks about alternative facts, and then the social media and the internet and Fox News, it's just proliferated into this mountain, right? Way too many facts, misinformation, disinformation, distorting of reality, distorting of facts, escapism, all sorts of stuff, where it's always been true. But in 2002, this advisor to Mr. Bush said it outright. And then it's just gotten carried over and over more extreme ways because technology. So there's a part of technology that is appealing again to the most primitive drives. That's what the head of Facebook says, is that we're fighting for your attention. We're competing for attention. We go further and further into the brain stem. So on the one hand, this huge high-tech society is going to become green technology. We're going to be sustainable. We're going to have this incredibly culture integrated with nature. We'll have a carbon neutral. We'll clean up. We'll stop using plastic. We'll have some environmentally recyclable kind of substitute for plastic. We'll go whole hog, and people will make money developing in all these layers, all these ways of saving this balance between humans and the natural world. That's one direction that is going. The other one is that we're just appealing to more and more primitive drives in the psyche, and we're going back to the Stone Age in terms of our emotions. But now we have nuclear weapons, and we have um, cybersecurity. I mean, we have cyber wars. So we have some bad actors, right, using that high tech to disrupt, destroy, or to gain power or wealth in these very nefarious, wicked ways. But again, that's happened before. That's what happened to the Greeks. That's what happened to the Germans. That's what happens over and over again. The god Apollo, the god of reason, the gifts he gives to humankind are a mixed bag, right? Sometimes they, you know, they, so the illusion of progress. Progress is progress in technology, but it's not progress in experience, pleasure, and pain, and living for the sake of everybody flourishing, right? The virtues. So we're stuck in that right now. We're stuck in a new layer, the fourth industrial revolution, and let us hope it all works out. All right, so that's the lecture for today. Especially if you're from a developing country, I'd love to hear your reactions to Karl Marx's manifesto. Does it describe the way the West has exploited your country? Are there any? Do you have a communist party in your country? Um, do your politicians tend to be somewhere in between capitalism and communism? They try to juggle how to create an economy without giving the West too many benefits, too much freedom to exploit them. But on the other hand, not kicking out capitalists altogether, right? So they have to figure this out. All right. So that's the end of lecture number 19.